Head of Economics and Government will also be speaking to experts across their fields, including Kelly Beaver, Chief Executive for the UK and Ireland at the polling company Ipsos. Now, polls just closing. Once they have, we'll bring you the exit polls that should come out very, very shortly, and that gives us an early indication of the results. Now, here they are. They're just coming out as we speak. It does look that the Labour actually is projected to win 410 seats out of 650. I mean, that's a pretty incredible majority. Now, this is taking place at the moment, so we'll have a full breakdown of what the exit polls are telling us. Stephanie, I mean, look, the exit poll is just coming out now. Labour projected to win 410 seats out of 650. I mean, this is almost really a landslide.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a landslide because we call much smaller numbers than that landslides. And I think certainly it's a huge increase from that appalling appalling result for Labour in 2019. And I think I'm right in saying sort of at the high end of some of the expectations. I mean, the polls have certainly been giving some very big numbers for Labour over the last few weeks. But I would say that is definitely not undershooting by a very large margin. Yeah,
it's pretty incredible. I mean, 179 was the size of Tony Blair's landslide majority in 1997 when there were 659 seats in the House of Commons. So we continue with the exit poll. Again, Labour projected to win 410 seats. And I think, actually, the Conservatives are about 131, if I'm not mistaken. So let's also get to Kelly Beaver from Ipsos. Kelly, this is like the poll of polls. I mean, this is usually a very reliable poll that you put together with some of the broadcasters. Tell us more about methodology.
So this is different from any of the other polls that people will have seen in the run-up to Election Day, because it's not projecting how people are going to vote. It is specifically asking them about their specific behaviour and how they have voted. 133 polling stations around this country will have operations representatives from Ipsos within them, and they will ask people to physically replicate their ballot in a sealed box as they come out of the electoral station. So as a result, you gather their actual behaviour, and then those results are modelled by Sir John Curtis and his team, and they produce the exit poll models that you're seeing right there.
I think what's interesting is we're seeing it does look like the majority, at least if this is right, the majority is in the region of 170, which actually puts it very close, just below the 1997, the Blair landslide. So that was a landslide, but it's not unprecedented going into new territory the way at least some of the polls had suggested.
So this is the key exit polls that we've been waiting for. So Labour predicted to win 410 seats. The Conservatives predicted to win 131 seats. The Liberal Democrats predicted to win 61 and Reform 13. What's the biggest upset given these numbers, Kelly?
Did you say Reform
13?
13.
Okay, that's the biggest
that is
upset.
The biggest upset. So Reform taking 13 seats, if that's correct, would be quite a feat, and I think that will cause quite a bit of upset in some of the projections that people have been portraying for Reform, definitely, yes.
Yeah, so UK Reform projected to win 13 seats, and then the SNP projected to win 10 seats.
That is very interesting, because we had previously thought that they would be very hamstrung. They could get a very high number of votes, as in fact UKIP had done in 2015, but not win many seats. Even I think the highest expectation for them was in the sort of 2s and 3s, because they have a very evenly spread vote. The supporters are quite evenly spread, except for these few places like Clacton. So that's also going to bring in some very interesting new members of Parliament, including, well, Lee Anderson, but also, and clearly Nigel Farage, but many others who we won't know.
Yeah, and again, so the pound is actually trading steady, but this is because of the UK electoral system. It's a winner-takes-all election system, which favours the bigger parties at the expense of relatively minor ones, which is why we're expecting Reform to actually do quite well in the election, but not take so many seats. I mean, this is probably the biggest surprise that we hadn't seen.
I think so. Reform, if I looked at our MRP, which was produced, this is the constituency level model that we did back 2 weeks ago. It was projecting an average of 3, but up to 10 seats for Reform. And there was that level of margin of error around the Reform vote share. But this will most definitely be interesting to see where they are. So there's 3 that we would have identified, but there are others, real marginal plays in some very interesting seats, including including even in Scotland. So we'll be curious as the night goes on to see where they land. The Lib Dem vote share, though, at 60, that is a very strong performance by the Lib Dems when you look at their historical performance and by standards as well. I think the highest they'd had was in 2005 at 62, so that is a reasonable performance for them.
And remembering that they only had 11 seats last time, so that's a pretty big turnaround and makes them a significant force in Parliament, which obviously some people will be wondering what will we give the executive an enormous amount of power in the UK relative to many other countries, and then to also give a Prime Minister this kind of significant majority, there will and losing a lot of senior sort of seasoned Conservative ministers who might have continued to sit as MPs. I mean, that means potentially a concern around scrutiny, certainly a complete change in the way Parliament feels. And yes, those 13 Reform MPs will certainly spice things up as well.
So a reminder of the provisional timeline of some of the key moments that we'll see in the next 12 hours. So voting has ended. We're just seeing the exit poll. At 11 p.m. we start seeing the first results coming in from the northeast of England. 2 a.m. we understand that nearly 100 districts usually have declared. 4 a.m. with half of the results in, it'll be pretty clear whether the exit poll is accurate or not. And then at 5 a.m. We should have some 600 seats that have been announced, and the TV channels are then likely to declare a winner, including ourselves. Now let's get straight to our Bloomberg UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden, who's also at Westminster. Lizzie, we'll get these seat-by-seat results from 11 p.m. onwards. Do Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt hold on to their seats? And if not, how does that change the Conservative Party?
Indeed, they are two to watch. You'll have to excuse me, Francine. My hair's all over the place because the winds of change are blowing, it would appear, in Westminster from this exit poll. Not quite the supermajority that some were expecting, and not quite the landslide of Tony Blair. But when we look seat by seat, there is a lot of drama to come later this evening. That's what I love about UK elections. It's a faster one than you get in the US. Some to watch. You mentioned the Prime Minister. He could be the first incumbent Prime Minister to lose his seat in a general election. That result comes at 4 a.m. Then you could have voters taking their revenge on former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Her result comes at 5:30 a.m. And at 3:30 a.m. we've got a raft of others. You've got Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, whose dreams of taking over as Conservative leader could be completely dented if she loses her seat. And you mentioned as well the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. He's got a real threat from the Liberal Democrats that he's going to have to fend off as well.
Lizzie, the pound for the moment is pretty steady as, again, Labour is projected to win the UK election. 13 seats, if they go to Reform, how does it change policy in Parliament? Does it influence Labour in any way?
It's going to be really interesting to see how it influences the Conservatives as they try to pick up the pieces after this election. Again, if these polls are right, if you've got such an outperformance from Reform, does it drag the Conservatives to the right? Or do they think, look at Labour's victory and try to drag themselves to the centre ground, to try to make themselves electable again? You know, this is the natural party of government, supposedly, in history. It's a question for potentially if there is a new leader, but another question is whether Rishi Sunak actually stays in the job, whether he is more like a caretaker like Michael Howard in 2005, or whether he leaves like David Cameron did. Does he get on the first flight to California? But you mentioned the market reaction. I think the reason that you're not seeing much of a reaction is because this has been very, very well priced in. Lots of guests coming on Bloomberg TV telling us that they're extremely relaxed about a Labour government.
Yeah, it's not really a market-moving event, especially when you have questions over Biden and question over France that probably take a lot of their time. Lizzie Burden, there, our Bloomberg UK correspondent, of course, joining us from Westminster. Now, these are the exit polls for the 6 biggest parties. You can see Keir Starmer, 410, Rishi Sunak, or the Conservatives, 131, Lib Dems, 61, Nigel Farage's party At 13, this is probably the biggest upset of the night. We have to ask ourselves what that means for the Conservative Party going forward. I know one of the big question marks was whether at some point he could even take over the Tories. You have the SNP at 10 and then Plaid Cymru at 4. I mean, there has been a lot of talk, Stephanie, about, again, what happens to the Conservative Party. A lot will depend on what happens to the seat of Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak. But does this bring the Tories actually more to the right?
You know, a lot will depend. A lot will depend on the next leader. There has been considerable discussion around the sort of comparison. It looks they've sort of dodged the extinction level event that people had talked about, where they were well under 100 seats, but there will still be potentially some big beasts who come sort of toppling down as the votes come in over the next few hours. And if those were, to the extent that those were potential future leaders, you're narrowing the field. Penny Mordaunt was one that Lizzie mentioned. She was known to be in quite a marginal seat, certainly a narrow seat. Jeremy Hunt also was someone who looked vulnerable, even with a relatively normal or, you know, not very large swing to Labour. So who becomes leader, and then how they decide to deal with what you might call the sort of reform wing of the party. You remember, you know, we have had conversations about this Nigel Farage, this very controversial figure, actually potentially being welcomed back into the party. You know, well, it would take a certain kind of leader to do that. Lizzie was suggesting that that was unlikely. I think she might well be right. But it will depend, again, on if you have this remaining 130 MPs, our estimation is that will look, the sort of broad spread of opinion will not be that different from now. But it's so hard to predict constituency by constituency. It could actually end up being a more moderate. If you think that the constituencies that had quite anti-European, potentially anti-immigrant, more far-right views, those will have been lost to reform, and potentially you do have a more moderate Conservative Party, and then that changes the dynamic, you know, if we even start looking to the next election.
Kelly, through all of your polling, what was this election about? Was it a referendum on the Conservatives after 14 years in power, or is it actually people that want a real change under Labour?
It's a desperate call for competence in government and a challenge around how Britain is broken. So when you look at what people wanted, they wanted change from what they were seeing in their daily lives, and that only rose as an expectation over the course of the electoral campaigning itself. We saw people's desire for change increase over that 6-week campaign period. They're worried about public services, they're worried about the economy and inflation, and there is a sizable proportion who are worried about immigration, and they were individuals who voted Conservative back in 2019. So those are the kind of issues that were at stake. The key thing comparatively to 2019, when you look at the issues, in 2019 it was 2 big issues: NHS, Brexit. This time that has proliferated into 4 issues, and actually those 4 issues included immigration, and you can see that impacting now on the reform vote share and the number of seats the exit poll is projecting that they may take.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit later about the economy and what the promises that Labour has put in place. But, Stephanie, if the exit poll proves accurate, it's still a pretty terrible outcome for the Conservatives. I know 131 is not cataclysmic as expected, but can they be like a real opposition?
I think, you're quite right to remind us that even as recently as 6 months ago, certainly a year ago, we would have looked at those numbers. I mean, just remember, you know, in the last election, I was just trying to remind myself of the numbers because they were so low. They have got more than double the number of seats they had coming out of the last election, Labour. So they only had around 200 before. Now it looks like it'll be over 400. We were saying that was such, to go from 200 to get a majority, very few people thought that was even possible a couple of years ago. Many people predicted that maybe there would be a hung parliament. You would have 2 elections in the space of a year or so as Labour tried to consolidate. So we should remember how far things have come. Yeah. So that's also a reminder of how fast they could swing back if things aren't perceived to be going well. We see across the world incumbents having trouble repeatedly. That's helped Labour this time. Won't necessarily help them in 5 years' time. But I think, it does go back to this question of, at least for now, you have someone with a very significant majority who potentially does not have to worry about troublesome people in their own party, let alone the opposition.
OK, thank you both. Kelly Beaver, Chief Executive for the UK and Ireland at polling company Ipsos, and, of course, Stephanie Flanders is with me for the hour. Our special coverage of the UK election exit poll continues shortly. This is Bloomberg.
Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. From breakfast cereals to pet foods, General Mills has an iconic array of brands. But future success depends on efficiency, innovation, and insight. CFO Kofi Bruce does much more than crunch numbers.
Our first job is to intimately understand and anticipate the consumer's needs.
Watch Chief Future Officer. New episode Wednesday on Bloomberg Television. Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
People ask me all the time, what is the key to being a really good investor? And I tell them it's to surround yourself with and work with the best investors you can find. On Bloomberg Wealth, I'm going to take you to meet the greatest investors in the world, the people that I would like to have managing my money.
The private markets in general have exploded at the expense of the public markets. Part of that's regulatory, part of that's just structural in the market. Private credit particularly exploded when the banks took a step back.
The next Prime Minister is in for a short honeymoon as the UK faces challenges on multiple fronts. For starters, there's growth, which is proving elusive. The economy is forecast to expand just 0.7% this year and 1.2% in 2025. That's after stagnating and even experiencing a short recession last year. Productivity has also stalled, falling behind the US and other rich countries. The new Prime Minister is under pressure to control legal migration and to confront small boat crossings in the English Channel, both of which hit record highs under the last government. On housing, the UK would need a city the size of London to catch up on the backlog, with 10 people for every new property in the worst affected areas. Said to be the closest thing the UK has to a national religion, the NHS is in crisis. The waiting list in England has stretched to over 7.5 million, and it's estimated the health service needs an extra £38 billion a year. All of this comes at a time when the UK has a massive debt hangover. Servicing that debt in a world of high interest rates is costing £60 billion a year. Now that threatens to tie the hands of the next government, or to force them into unpopular tax hikes and public spending cuts.
That was Bloomberg's Alex Morgan reporting on the many challenges facing the next government. Now, these are the exit polls for the 6 biggest parties. Labour 410, according to the exit poll. Conservatives 131. Better than expected, but still, frankly, quite dismal. You see the Lib Dems at 61. Reform probably the biggest upset. This is Nigel Farage's party with 13 seats, according to the exit polls. And you have SNP 10, Plaid Cymru at 4. Now, the pound has been little changed after the exit poll was released. Joining Stephanie and I now is John Stepik. John, when you look at market, I mean, it wasn't really a market event because the polls had Labour so far ahead for such a long time. And frankly, there are other distractions around the world right now when it comes to politics.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a market event. It's basically what the markets were expecting and ultimately hoping for. They were looking for a government to win decisively. It was expected to be Labour, and that's what we've got. It's slightly less of a supermajority landslide wipeout than the most dramatic polls had expected, but it's really well within the boundaries of what the markets had hoped for. So it's essentially a non-event, and that is positive given what's going on in France and the US at the moment.
Yeah, because the UK is seen as stable. When does it become an event? Again, there's very little fiscal space on what the new government can do.
Yeah, I think we'll be looking... I mean, Rachel Reeves, who's now coming in as the potential Chancellor, first woman Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister for the UK, she has said that anything that she announces in terms of her first budget will be properly vetted by the independent fiscal watchdog. So that sort of makes it harder to have sort of immediate, big showy things that are economically important in the first few days. But I think they will want to signal that focus that they've had all along on economic growth. And as we go forward to that budget, I think the markets and investors will be looking to see what wiggle room they've found within the quite tight fiscal straitjacket that they've put themselves into, signing up to the same fiscal rules, the same rules on debt and borrowing as the previous government. what room they've found for more investment as well as spending on public services, which of course a lot of their supporters feel is desperately overdue. But it's interesting, I often now talk to people in the city and investors who would actually be willing to see debt rise, a bit more borrowing, if it is to invest, if it comes attached to an aggressive approach to building more houses, to reducing obstacles to planning, all of those things which they've talked about so much, which really could move the dial on growth.
Yeah, and actually the overarching question, because we talk about skills, we talk, of course, about housing, we talk about, for example, trade and the like. But at the end of the day, how do they achieve growth, which has been quite anemic in the UK?
I mean, a lot of it is, I agree with Stephanie there. I think what's really worth remembering here is the Liz Truss incident in 2022 was caused by a unique set of circumstances. Our debt situation in the UK just now is chronic, but it's not acute. So Rachel Reeves doesn't need to do anything drastic about it right now. So she's absolutely right to just bang the drum and try and tell a good story on growth. And the kind of fortunate thing for her at the moment is that actually all the indicators are pointing the right way anyway. So there is a kind of tailwind there. You've got interest rates. The next move in interest rates is going to be down. Real wages are growing and have been for quite some time. There's household balance sheets. The national balance sheet is in a bad condition, but household and corporate balance sheets are pretty healthy. So in a way, all you need to do is get a better sentiment behind things.
All you need to do is a better sentiment.
Tell a good story. Tell a good story.
I think it's a bit like we're looking at these Conservatives. We saying, it's a bit better than expected for the Conservatives, but it's the worst since 1905. It's going to be the smallest number. I think we're in danger of a little bit of expectations management when it comes to growth. I mean, the average growth rate of the previous Labour government under Tony Blair, which was in very different economic circumstances, around the world, President Clinton, others were also having a good, relatively easy time of it, was 2.5% a year. The expected average potential growth now is more like 1.1, 1.2, if you're lucky, and that's actually more than it's been over the last few years. So you can get a bit more of a catch-up, a bit more of a recovery, but if you don't get that basic potential growth rate up with structural change, you are still not able to spend as much as this population wants to spend on things like health and education.
John, how much should we look at also the pledges of labour and the workforce, right? So this is labour laws that could be stricter. I mean, is there a danger that it needs to be perfectly calibrated, otherwise you can kill off growth or actually hurt investment from coming in the country? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, they need to be careful, and this is why when kind of Rachel Reeves kind of stands up, she needs to just... There's the temptation to say, oh my goodness, look at what I've inherited, this is a disaster. But that's not the tone that she's going to want to take. This is the point about kind of talking up the growth story. But I also think there are things that they can do that they're intending to do to quite quickly, if you like, give GDP something of a sugar rush. So if you liberate the planning system sufficiently that building actually gets going, then that gives quite a good boost to GDP because it's quite an intensive part of the economy. And so, I mean, I think there's a lot that they can do, particularly because they've also got the mandate. Ultimately, Conservatives are going to spend the next 5 years squabbling the way that they did after the 1997 election, particularly because Reform are going to be there distracting them all the time. And also, if Keir doesn't quite get the super wipeout mega majority that people were thinking he'd get, it means that the hard left of his party... I know, but what I mean is, the thing is, the bigger the majority, the more kind of the hard left that would have got in. So he's going to have fewer distractions on that front. So, I think this is not a bad situation to be in. And if Britain is, if growth is still possible in this country, then it should be possible to make it happen with this set of results and in this current environment.
I think the interesting thing people will be watching, certainly the two things I think that will be important to the business community and economists, to be honest, is, as John mentions, how serious are they on the housing target? Because we've never actually built as many houses as they're planning to build. 300,000 a year they're hoping for. That's a lot of banging of heads and making yourself unpopular on planning decisions. Actually, the minister in charge overruling planning decisions, that's what they'd have to do. And I think also on the employment rules, do they, because they're not haven't got a lot of money to spend? Do they end up having big legal changes that really affect this very flexible labour market? I think those are the two things people will be watching.
But on planning, do they have to start straight away? I mean, this is not a reform of the planning system. This is overruling. Basically,
well, they have. I mean, this is what people have talked about. We've forgotten, but the Docklands, which many people now associate with this, amazing development on the east of London, lots of the big banks all based there, was very controversial when that development was done. And the then minister, Michael Heseltine, actually insisted, change the rules so that the objections could be overturned. And those rules are still on the books, but it has to be done by the Secretary of State, by the minister. So, and it could go to the court, some of those things, which, of course, you've now got a lawyer in charge. Maybe that's helpful.
And again, it kind of, you only have a couple of months to make a real change at the beginning, especially with this kind of majority, I guess. So they have to go in fast.
Well, yeah, they go in fast, but like you said, they've got a big majority. They've got the space to do things that would be unpopular, possibly if they were done by the previous government. They can point to their mandate. This is the time for making the bold and potentially unpopular decisions, because it's another 5 years before the next election. If you're going to do the tough stuff, do it now.
John and Stephanie, thank you so much. So the UK election exit poll projecting Labour to win a majority of 170. Pound little changed after the exit poll was released, and then it's at 11:30 p.m. that results will actually start trickling in.
Looking at your portfolio of businesses, it is about resilience, it's about pressure, it's about women. So how does that come together how does it manifest in the deals that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I became increasingly passionate about after I retired, was acknowledging the fact that focus and this performance mindset was a huge asset that I had gained and that I had worked on and perfected for over 20 years. And now working through brands and founders, I just recently announced a collaboration with the Amman Hotel Group, where I bring in the best talents in sports recovery and performance mindset in retreats and offering it there to their clientele. Our first one is actually in Phuket in February. So working through what that means, I mean, if you see the stats of Fortune 500 female CEOs, 80% of those women have played sport competitively through their life journey. And all those skill sets that they've built, to me, they were part of this first chapter, right? But how do they now apply to everything else I'm doing? And I'm so curious and interested in how I can bring that to the audience now and make it more mainstream and accessible.
The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day. Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close, weekdays at 3 p.m. only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg.
Welcome back, everyone, to our special coverage of the UK general election. These are the exit polls for the 6 biggest parties. Labour projected to win a majority of 170, so that's 410 seats. The Conservatives, 131 seats. We have the Lib Dems, 61 seats. Now, if the polling proves accurate, the Liberal Democrats are projected to overtake the Scottish National Party as the UK's third largest party with 61 seats. So that's significant. The other upset, probably the biggest of the night, is Nigel Farage's party, Reform, with 13 seats, and then Plaid Cymru at 4 seats. This is the very latest. What we heard, again, the exit polls, according to the BBC, I think gives Labour a 100% chance of gaining 110 Conservative-held seats. That's big. I know there has been questions about whether the majority is as big as expected. It still feels very big. So let's return to our UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden, who's at Westminster. Lizzie, with this projected kind of majority, what can Labour actually achieve in terms of policies?
Well, it's not quite the supermajority that some polls had expected. It's not annihilation for the Conservatives either, so there's disappointment on both sides, although I'm sure Keir Starmer would be very happy if this exit poll translated into actual results. What could they achieve? Well, they can easily get legislation through Parliament with a majority like this. It's going to be easier to dominate the select committees, easier for the whips to have patronage to control MPs, but it won't be the untrammelled power, the absolute dominance of Parliament that a 250-plus seat majority would have given them. And there won't be as much pressure, perhaps, to go for more and more radical economic growth that you would have seen with that supermajority.
I mean, the currency, the sterling, has been on a tear in recent days, hitting a 3-week high against the dollar this week. At the moment, it's not really changing much. It doesn't feel like a market event at all, Lizzie, because if this exit poll is correct, the previous polls were broadly right.
Exactly. This was well priced in. But I would say that over the coming months, you could see more of a pickup in the UK as a safe haven asset, particularly compared to France and the US, depending on the political situations there. It depends on where the centre of gravity ends up being in the UK. You talked about the outperformance of the Liberal Democrats. Do you see more of a centre of gravity that's more friendly to the European Union? Does that mean that Keir Starmer's promises to have closer ties with the EU on trade actually bear fruit? And then you see a rise in sterling later. It has been that way in recent days. Do you see more of that? And tomorrow, I would expect a bit of a pickup in UK equities. The day of the general election in '97 that put Tony Blair in Downing Street, you saw the FTSE 100 hit a record. Tomorrow, you could probably see a bit of a boost to the FTSE 250, given that it's more domestically focused than the FTSE 100.
Lizzie, thanks so much. Lizzie Burden there, our Bloomberg UK correspondent at Westminster. We were talking about, of course, Brexit, or the fact that one of the promises in the manifesto for Labour, Stephanie, we're trying to get closer to the EU. There's not much willingness on the EU side to give anything for the UK, also because they're distracted by domestic policies.
I mean, we have a sort of changing of the guard in the European Union, obviously, with the Commission level, and Hungary, indeed, in the next 6 months, in charge of, or at least leading the EU formally. So I think in these next few months, I think it's going to be quite difficult. But there are specific deals that certainly the Labour side feel are on the table when it comes to mutual recognition of some professional service qualifications. There was an offer, actually, from the Europeans over young people under 30s being able to have freedom of movement of some kind. That was actually rejected by Keir Starmer in the election campaign, but it's potential that could change. But yes, they haven't talked about the kind of big offer, big new deal, which I think would involve, would excite people. A lot of their voters, majority of the people who voted for Labour today will be will be supportive of a much more open relationship than that Labour have talked about. But the amount of political capital you have to invest in trying to get the Europeans to focus on that and going through all the details when they really want to get to work on UK issues, I suspect it won't be immediate.
So how will also this result be received by business leaders? Our city editor, Catherine Griffiths, also joins us. Catherine, again, this seems pretty much as expected, but there are a number of questions that, the city has for the new government.
Yes, certainly. I think the city will be, this might even be a sort of a sweet spot of a result for them if this turns out to be the final outcome. It's a strong Labour majority, but not perhaps a sort of overwhelming one that people might then think, well, is this an existential crisis for the Conservative Party, which could lead to some concerns down the line. But the city still wonders whether Keir Starmer and his shadow cabinet, soon to be the actual cabinet, have surprises up their sleeve that could be good for the city in terms of sort of, strong radical plans to really kind of go forward with infrastructure investment, green investment, but also does in fact Keir Starmer have a whole host of wealth taxes up his sleeve too, which won't go down well in the city.
Is there anything that he's promised to not to touch? I mean, there have been pledges, and we know that Rachel Reeves has also gone around to speak to city grandees, to CEOs, to chief financial officers. Will they touch actually business tax?
I think they've made a pledge on corporation tax, but for the banks, they desperately want all sorts of things taken away from them. They pay a surcharge on their profits, they pay a levy on their balance sheets. They would love those things to go away, but they know they're not going to at this time. But what they don't want, the sort of city and the finance community more widely, are wealth taxes. You've got the whole issue around private equity firms and carried interest. How hard will Rachel Reeves actually go on that policy? And could there be other things too which will hit that group of people?
Stephanie, do you know how close they are to the city? Again, we talk about, the UK maybe needing an industrial plan. I know Jim Ratcliffe was really, up in arms by the fact that we don't really have one. But will they put, the city before a manufacturing plan?
I think that's a good point. I mean, Rachel Reeves has certainly invested the time. There had been, famously under Tony Blair, there was, before he came in, there had been the prawn cocktail offensive where he'd gone and had lunched with a large number of people in the financial sector. She's done a bit of that and I think has reassured people. And as we've said right throughout this, that the key thing for many in the business community, whether they're in the City of London or more broadly, is that, this change of government, ironically, after so many governments that were formerly Conservative but involved enormous swings in tax policy and spending policy. This change of government is a vote for stability over the kind of upheaval that we've had under the Conservatives for 14 years. So I think that is the main thing, and I think they are persuaded that there will be stability with this majority. And I think there's also an understanding that there has to be growth in the broader economy, even in the city.
But we also had a couple of stories, Catherine, by Ben Stupples, saying that actually some of the billionaires or the rich have decided to leave the UK for a number of reasons, including the non-doms.
Yes, certainly, anecdotally, that seems to be the case. People are sort of sizing up places like Milan as a great place to go and not pay too much tax. But I think there is some real consideration going on in the Rachel Reeves team as to, well, how much does it matter, actually, if quite a small group of people leave London, that perhaps that doesn't really affect the kind of this point about growth. You've got kind of the big UK banks that will play such a big part in providing all the syndicated loans for a big infrastructure investment, and they're not really going anywhere.
I would say also, I think there's one thing that we may notice that they will need the city for, because they've sort of tied themselves quite closely to these fiscal rules. One way you could still get public increase investment that looks like public investment but actually doesn't come up as public investment borrowing on the books is to have these sort of arm's length private sector vehicles supported by government, but with the at least the initial money coming from the private sector for those kind of big investments, and they will need the city for that. So I think there could be an interesting synergy between the two things you were just talking to me about, that you would actually use the city to help deploy money into the parts of the economy that need it. Whether that's efficient rather than the government just borrowing on its own account is another matter.
Do we know what they'll do actually on pensions? I know one of the things that, city grantees always talk about is the fact that there's not enough risk-taking like there is in the US. And so that, the Tories had pledged to do this like British ISA, which would give a percentage to UK companies. I mean, what can we expect from Labour?
So I think they've said that they're going to have a review, and actually I think City and business aren't very keen on endless reviews. I think they've had a lot of reviews into a whole lot of things. But on this one, probably pensions is such a huge issue, people accept there will be a review. But essentially, I think where Labour is headed is to have larger pools of pension money, which will make it easier to invest into private assets, infrastructure and that kind of thing. But what Labour is going to have to face is that trade-off. Are they going to force pension funds and other UK investors to invest some of that money into UK assets in return for the tax breaks they get?
Stephanie, what's a business case? If you have a pool of money, sitting outside the UK, is there a business case for bringing it to the UK because it feels, with this majority, a lot more stable than other parts of the world?
I mean, I think when you're looking around, and of course there's also a sort of, even the people who are leaving, potentially going to Paris are kind of rethinking. So maybe they're thinking Milan, or maybe they're just thinking they might stay in the UK. So I think there's definitely a relative advantage to the UK now of being something of a sort of oasis of stability. And we know that, the UK market has hugely underperformed over the last 10 years or so. And if there's a prospect, so in that sense, there's kind of upside potential, as we would always see. But, there is something of a value play, which we've even seen come through in the performance of the market this year. So, I think there will be people who will be making a stronger case for the UK than you can currently make for Europe on many of those dimensions.
So if the exit poll is correct, Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister tomorrow. Rachel Reeves will almost certainly be the UK's first female Chancellor. Do we know who anyone else is in the cabinet? Are there going to be business people? Is it going to be very skewed towards business?
Well, I think a big question will be whether Jonathan Reynolds becomes the business secretary. I think likely he will do, but he's definitely to the left of some of the other main characters. And I think business has got quite comfortable with him. He, like Rachel Reeves, has been going around and doing some prawn cocktailing. But, whether he's the sort of business secretary down the line, maybe that's a bit less certain.
I mean, there are so many questions also on what happens to the SNP. I mean, this was the party and it's done much worse than expected.
Yes, I was just reminding myself, because I think they had 50 seats, or around 50 seats, nearly 50 seats, the Scottish Nationalist Party, in the last election, and that's now potentially down to the sort of low double figures, sort of 10 or 11, I can't remember what we have there. So that is a big shift after many years where they have been the dominant party of government in Scotland, and is partly due to, again, this kind of anti-incumbency view, but also some scandals and serious problems that they've had. So, I mean, that will be significant for Labour, because remember, they had their traditional coalition in the north of England and in Scotland had just fallen apart from 2015 onwards. At least, if this exit poll's right, they've managed to stitch back that coalition and perhaps pick up some quite affluent Conservative areas that they wouldn't previously have targeted.
Yeah, and again, if the exit poll is right, so Reform is now on track to form the fourth largest party in Parliament, bigger than the SNP. And it's pretty remarkable. It's a pretty remarkable projection for a new political party, which rose in opinion polls since Nigel Farage, the famed Brexiteer, took it over weeks into that campaign. Does that influence policies? I mean, how would the city look at that?
I think the city's definitely not going to be keen on Nigel Farage's party having a significant say in Parliament. But I suppose what they'll be looking for is whether Keir Starmer feels he's got the strength and the inclination to give political capital to this issue that is Europe. And as Stephanie says, I think there's a whole host of domestic issues, but certainly the city and business definitely want a closer relationship with Europe. They're almost united on that point.
But, Catherine, how does that work? I mean, if the EU is not giving you a new deal, do you just say we're going to follow the rules and do the same and hope for the best?
Yeah, I think certainly in finance, they all know each other, the regulators know each other. I think, since it's become increasingly clear that Starmer and Labour were going to win, they've been sort of putting more effort into warming up those relationships again in Brussels and also all over the place. And I think they hope they can get something out of that.
I mean, obviously, the big question mark, I mean, on the financial side, and certainly when it comes to, like, the European Central Bank, those kind of relations and financial regulators of relations is fine. But given that we're now entering a period of turmoil and weakness at the top of some of Europe's biggest countries, notably France and Germany, with President Macron and Chancellor Olaf Scholz both weakened, and potentially a new prime minister or a very different political situation in France just in a few days' time, I think that is a challenge for an incoming Labour administration that had invested quite a lot in its relationships with these leaders who are now, losing political capital almost by the hour.
All right, up next, we'll talk about the Bank of England as well. Catherine, thank you so much. Catherine Griffiths, there, Bloomberg's city editor. Now, our special coverage of the UK election exit poll continues shortly. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Alex Rodriguez. I'm a former New York Yankee and played professional baseball for over 20 years. Almost that entire time, I was thinking about business.
And I'm Jason Kelly. I've been a business journalist at Bloomberg for more than 2 decades. And across my career, I've covered everything from the Olympics to Wall Street.
From Bloomberg, this is The Deal. Each week, you'll hear us in conversation with business icons.
This show will explore deal-making across sports, media, and entertainment.
This is very fancy for a podcast.
If I knew what it was going to be, I'd have put everything I had into it.
I get asked more about our relationship than I do my wife. You know what I'm saying?
This is a show where we talk with big-time athletes and executives about the wins, the losses, and lessons learned along the way.
This show is called The Deal.
The Deal.
The Deal. The Deal. That deal. The Deal.
Huge deal.
Who dug this up? What are y'all's in trouble?
Wow.
Back to our special coverage of the UK general election. Now, these are the exit polls for the 6 biggest parties. Labour for 110, Conservative 131. Now, that gives, of course, Labour a majority of 170. Then we have the Lib Dems at 61, Reform with 13 seats, according to the exit polls, SNP at 10, and Plaid Cymru at 4. So this is the very latest. We're joined again, of course, by John Stepek. But, Stephanie, first of all, just worth reminding everyone, this is an exit poll.
Yes.
But we treat it like gospel because it's been right in the past.
No member of Parliament has won or lost their seat yet. We won't find that out for another hour or two. Most of the seats won't be decided for several hours. We have come to believe in these exit polls because particularly in the last 15 years or so, they've had a much more rigorous methodology, and so they've been very close on almost every occasion. And they've certainly, if the message is a very large majority for Labour, they have been, they have not been wrong enough to remotely question that judgment. But I think, we should remind people this is not the definitive result, but we have got reason to put a lot of trust in it.
Yeah, so if the exit poll is correct, Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister tomorrow. Rachel Reeves will almost certainly be the first UK female Chancellor as well. John, when you look at, I guess, the priorities, so you have the Conservatives. I don't know whether they'd be happy with 131. I mean, it's not as disastrous, but frankly, it's really quite bad. And then the SNP also did very poorly.
I mean, if you asked the Conservatives a year ago, what is this result, they'd be like, that's catastrophic, that's never happening. If you asked them yesterday, they'd be like, thank God, second place. You know, so, I mean, it's all about, you know, the expectations towards the end definitely got quite overheated. And also, but as Stephanie says, I mean, this is just an exit poll. There are so many weird factors in this particular election. I mean, Reform getting 13 seats strikes me as punchy, given that, you know, most people thought they would get 2.
I think that is, and of course, the key thing, one of the key things about the methodology in exit polls is with the comparison with, they actually look at particular polling stations and see changes over time relative to the last time, and they have already said they were struggling in modelling the Reform vote, because obviously formally the Reform Party didn't exist. This party with the controversial figure Nigel Farage now taking the helm at the beginning of the campaign, they were modelling it on the previous Brexit Party, which was a kind of odd grouping. So I do think there's of course, they may have undershot, but there's most scope for error there, I would have thought.
Yeah, so just a reminder of the timeline, maybe. This is a good time to remind everyone. In about, I think, 10 minutes from now, we'll start seeing the first results coming in from the northeast of England. At 2 a.m., nearly 100 districts usually have declared. 4 a.m., it's the first results. Half of the results will be in by around 4:30 a.m. And then at 5 a.m., some 600 seats should be announced results. And then they'll call the winner. So, John, we could have this very weird kind of, you know, seats changing with Nigel Farage in Parliament, but Jeremy Hunt actually losing a seat.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that's what happens when you get a landslide. You know, the big beasts lose. It's, what was it, like the Michael Portillo moment? I remember in 1997, wasn't it? Everyone stayed up for. And then, of course, he went on to become an elder statesman of TV. But there you go, that's what most politicians end up doing. I do think the SNP result was interesting as well. I mean, there's not as much attention paid to the SNP down here. But one reason that's happened is because, similar to the Tories, Scotland has been run in a very chaotic manner. Lots of scandal, lots of mistakes, not a lot to show for the time in government. And so, to me, it's not very surprising that everyone's decided, well, actually, let's go back to Labour as they used to.
I do think, as well as remembering that this was, you know, we considered it to be a sort of core vote strategy at the beginning of the campaign. If they were thinking about aiming for 200 seats, that was sort of a low bar, and then the bar fell and fell and fell over the course of the campaign. This is a changing of the guard after 14 years of Conservative government, so it is a very big change for the UK, which we've got used to thinking about. And actually, you know, people have turned it into a bit of a game that you have a bingo card that people are going to be sitting at home. You can download these from lots of different places.
Can I just say the name of it? Because it's called the Tory 2024 Meltdown Wall Chart, which is something to be beholden.
To pin on your wall.
I'd say that on election night, but it's basically people that have been, you know, part of the Conservatives for a long time.
Famous faces who many people, and certainly younger voters, they will have been the party of government, the people of government, for all of their sort of politics-thinking lives. So we shouldn't forget, you know, with all of this talk about expectations, of course it's no surprise that Labour's forming a government. This is a momentous changing of the guard with a lot of former senior officials potentially over the next 6 or 7 hours being out of a job.
But how does this impact, you know, the ability of the opposition party to do real opposition? How does it impact the Treasury Select Committees? How does it impact, does Rishi Sunak have any chance of staying as leader?
I mean, I think we've talked about how you have now all these big beasts who've either stood down before the election, said they don't want to stand again, or potentially will fall through the course of this evening. That means not only that there's a smaller number of people to be the next Conservative Party leader, who will be the leader of the opposition in the UK, but also potentially, yes, far fewer sort of older and wiser figures with experience of Parliament. Parliaments are complicated. You know, people watch sometimes the opening of Parliament, or they watch Prime Minister's questions, Black Rod with his funny outfit and all these things. I mean, the number of MPs who understand how Parliament works and can use it to scrutinise legislation is going to be much smaller in this government than in the past. Lots of new Labour MPs who weren't really vetted because because they weren't expected to win when they were first chosen, and lots of very sort of senior people no longer there to be a check and balance, if you like.
I mean, do the Conservatives also swing more to the right to get cozier to the Reform Party with 13 seats, if the exit poll's correct?
Well, I mean, this is the issue. It's more, I mean, whatever happens, I mean, again, if you think about it going back to 1997, I mean, the Tories really didn't feature, certainly not in my memory, for that whole first Parliament. And I can see the same thing happening now. There's going to have to be a sort of big election too, so it's not a very, happy task for whoever does it.
There is an argument, I mean, comparisons have been made, and it turns out to be slightly overdone, but with the Canadian Conservative Party that was completely destroyed in one election. There's a number of senior people in the Conservative Party who are saying they waited a year, they had an interim leader, and then they had a year to sort themselves out, to work out their differences. I mean, the Conservative Party is very divided, and I think to have a longer lead-up for this next leadership campaign will be important. But the really interesting thing is no one's going to care because, as John says, they will be the opposition at the beginning of a new parliament. Who cares about the opposition at the beginning of a new parliament?
Yeah, and I wonder whether Rishi Sunak would have rather waited if we get that Bank of England cut than in August. Right, I feel maybe the timing was a bit off, or it probably wouldn't have made a difference.
I think he was right to rip the bandage off because, what was going to happen in 5 months' time? The economy might look a bit better, might have been one rate cut.
I think all the people who've lost their jobs 6 months earlier than they thought they were going to would wish that he's held on.
All right.
I mean, okay, that's true.
That's one way of putting it. John and Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us for this election coverage. That wraps our special coverage of the UK election exit poll. We'll have updates throughout the night and, of course, in-depth coverage, reaction and analysis from 5 a.m. UK time as a full picture emerges. If the exit poll is correct, Keir Starmer's Prime Minister.